say that. Hurricane season is, although it is coming on us, isn't it? It's just exactly right. I am so grateful to be in the book of James with you. We're going to be finishing up over the next 3 weeks. Today we'll get down to James chapter 5, verse 11, and we'll finish up the book in new study next week, and then we'll do a review, a bird's eye view of this book that we've spent about 3 months studying. Just a reminder, James is someone whom was very close to Jesus. You remember James was the brother of Jesus, and this is the James who had been a Jew, was a Jew, and you can tell because he speaks a lot about Israel and the lessons of Israel even today, for example, from the stories of the prophets and Elijah. His world was very different than ours, wasn't it? Nearly 2,000 years ago. That's a different world. And so he lived in a world that was agrarian. What is an agrarian world? A lot of farmers, right? A lot of plants and growing things. And you see that in this chapter. But James is a book, you remember, that's talking to us about what is wisdom. You know, he says, for example, in James chapter 1, verse 5, turn with me over there to James chapter 1, verse 5, when we pray to God without doubting, not doubting that God can provide what we ask for, what should we ask for? What should be one of the things that we seek God to give us in our life? There you go, wisdom. What is wisdom? What is wisdom? You think about that. It's some sort of knowledge. Is it just any sort of knowledge? What is it? Knowledge with experience. That is to say, you know what's right, you know what's true. I'm supposed to stop at a stop sign. I'm supposed to be loving towards my child. These are right, true things. You know something that's right to do, something that's true about the world. But you not only know that and believe that, you do that. Okay. Wisdom is faith that's put into practice, or knowledge that's applied in a skilled way. And so, we know lots of things, but being able to do it is difficult. What's an example of something in your life which you know to do, or you know that it's not to do, but it's difficult? Yeah.
Well, I know not to go away from my country.
Yeah.
Give us a to get going. Make sure that they're still going before you start going.
Right.
Because I actually told my first car.
Okay.
Because I learned from this.
Christian's talking about driving. A wise driver knows that just because the light turns green, you don't go. You survey left and right. Statistics tell us that the most common accident on the road is a car that's running a red light to your right. They're going through a 4-lane highway. They're going to run it. So you should. They say the best thing you can do as a driver is when the light turns green, look 45 degrees to your right and survey. And that's you've learned by experience. Now the question is, do you do that?
Well, actually, people like cars starting to go and then they stop going.
Yeah.
There's cars in front of me.
Okay.
But now that scenario, I didn't know what to do. Now I wait a little longer before I can go.
So even there, your car in front of you, are they actually going? Are they starting? So we have a lot of wisdom in driving. I get nervous when my young children go out and drive at 16, 18 years old because they've not gained experience. They don't necessarily know what to do. Alan, are you an experienced driver? You've gotten to learn how to do these things, right? But you know drivers that aren't, right? They may know the rules of the road, but they don't know how to apply it very well. I'm afraid I see a lot of those out there day to day, don't you? That's one example of wisdom. And now when we apply that to our relationship with God, there are things that we know about God. Does God exist? Yeah. Does God give us His Word to tell us what to do? Yes. Does God give us other Christians to be able to help us along life's way? Yes. Okay, we know all these things, but the question is do we apply that in our life? Do we pray to God, even though He exists, right? Do we read the Word, even though we know it's His truth, right? And do we engage with other Christians, coming and assembling and trying to help them? Well, the answer may be less common, more commonly, no. We don't do those things. And so we know certain things, but we what? We don't apply them. We don't do them. And that's the difference between what? Knowledge and wisdom. True in construction, right? True in being a mailman, true in being a teacher. They're just things you learn by experience that help you do things. And James is writing so that Christians have not only knowledge, but wisdom, okay? And one of the things, so just to skip forward to get to our passage, he says, look, there are two types of wisdom, okay? Let's flip over to chapter 3, verse 13. We're just trying to review here and get set for our lesson tonight. In chapter 3, verse 15, after he's talked about, well, how your faith needs to work, faith needs to take action or it's dead, right? Like the body without the spirit, he says in chapter 2. He talks about the tongue, how the tongue and our speech is so hard to control. Whew, isn't that the case, right? And so he's just saying, you got to control your tongue. He comes down in chapter 3, verse 13, and he asks a question. He says, hey, you folks there in Mariner Boulevard Church of Christ there in June 2025, who is wise? Do you consider yourself a wise person? You say, well, it depends on what you're talking about, right? He says, but he asked that question in chapter 3, verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? Okay? And so how would you show that you're wise according to chapter 3, verse 13? He says, by his what? Yeah, by his works, by his good conduct. Okay? Let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. So if I'm going to watch how Christian is wise in his driving, I'm going to watch not how he talks, but how he actually drives. And so he says, hey, show your wisdom by what you actually do. Okay? And then he goes on to say, he says there's two types of wisdom. This is really important. He says, if you're boasting, if you're ambitious, and you're being false to the truth, in verse 14, he says, verse 15, this is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but it's earthly, unspiritual, demonic, right? So, question, is every kind of wisdom God's wisdom? No. Do you know someone who has kind of a devilish, or we'll just say an earthly wisdom that's not from God? You do? What would be an example of someone who's wise in the ways of the world? What would be an example of that? You know somebody who can use worldly wisdom to their advantage? What's an example of that? Worldly wisdom. We're talking here about what James is talking about. He's saying, hey, if you're doing these things, yeah, Christian. Huh? Yeah, someone who knows how to make money, right? That might be someone, as you said, in the stock market who knows how to use the markets to their advantage, right? Can someone lie and cheat their way into making a lot of money with the stock market? Yeah. What I could do is, let's say, hey, there's a stock out there. Let's say it's Ed's Petroleum. Okay, Ed's Petroleum. And I bought it this morning, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you guys, hey, there's this great stock. It's called Ed's Petroleum. Y'all ought to go out and buy that. And if I got all of y'all, 20, 25 of you up to buy Ed's Petroleum, you know what that stock would do? It'd go up, And you know what I'm going to do tomorrow after you buy it? I'm going to sell. I just made myself a tiny profit. The problem is Ed's Petroleum is not a very good company, but you don't need to know that, and I don't really care because I just made my money. Okay, so did I make money? Did I know the rules of the game? Yeah. But was I truthful and charitable towards y'all? No. Now, Latasha, don't you go out and do this now that you know you can. He's saying there's a certain type of wisdom that's not from above. You know lots of that wisdom, right? Someone might be able to seduce someone, or someone might be able to somehow, get somebody to follow them and do evil. That's a wisdom of this world. Yeah, Roy?
Well, I just think going back into the time
Yes.
And he said that you will live as God with a small g.
Yes.
And you will know all things in knowledge.
Right.
That's his cunning way.
He has his cunning.
Undermining.
Yeah. Yeah. The devil, as Roy was talking about in the garden, was able to distort God's words. He said he didn't. He said you couldn't eat of that fruit because he doesn't want you to be like him. He didn't want you to have the wisdom of God, truth and knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil. And he distorted what God said. He knew what to do. That's what the devil does today. He always has an element of truth in what he offers us. If you do this, you'll feel good. Will you feel good? Yeah, for a moment, but then long-term consequences. Okay, but he goes on to say in verse 17, the wisdom from above is pure, peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy, good fruits, impartial, and sincere. That's a bunch of words, but the idea is that God wants us to know things and to do things that produces peace and gentleness, good fruits, sincerity, impartiality. You don't show preference to the rich and then put down the poor. And so in chapter 4, what we've seen is that when you're a Christian, you're not covetous, you're not quarrelsome with each other. You humble yourselves before the Lord, he says in verse 10, and God will exalt you. He's trying to get Christians to act on what they know, okay? And then you remember down in verse 13 to 17, a couple of weeks ago, we looked at how God's time is different than our time. Remember that? How, we say, I'm going to go out and do this, do such and so. In verse 13, I'm going to go out into such and such a town and spend a year and trade and make a profit. The problem is whose time are we on? Our time or God's time? God's time. And we know that, but wisdom says, you know what? Because God's in control, I'm going to act like it. Not only in terms of what I say, I'm going to say if the Lord wills, right? But I'm not going to demand what I want in time because I know that God's ultimately in control and will judge. And this has led us to his focus in chapter 5. James is really very concerned about wisdom and how we act and what we do, how we spend our time. But the primary evidence of wisdom in James throughout the book, from the very beginning of the book where he talks about how the wealthy should rejoice in their humiliation and the poor in their exaltation. The primary evidence of wisdom is not how we spend our time, although that's true, not how we use our tongue, although that's true, right? It's not even so much what we do with our hands. The primary evidence of wisdom is, let me break it to you gently, what we do with our money. That's what he says. He says, if you want to know whether you're wise, look at how you're using your savings or your checkbook. Okay, now he's all over my toes, right? So that's where James goes, and that's in chapter 5 where he's talking. He's talking to Christians that have some money, and he refers to them as rich. And we talked about a couple of weeks ago how, rich doesn't mean like Elon Musk rich necessarily. You don't have billions or even millions of dollars to be rich, You just need to have number one, a little bit of disposable income. You're not hand to mouth. You got some money in the bank or money in your pocket. Oftentimes the rich get rich because they have a love of money. Right? They love it. They think about it, right? And so, you know any rich people? Well, you probably are one of them, right? Not necessarily you have a love of money, but you got some money, okay? The average American, in terms of their savings, their income, their net worth, is 10 times the average American the rest of the world. 10 times. Think about that, okay? So that's a lot, average, okay? So we have a lot of wealth in this country. And you may not feel that, but you go to a country like India or even to some South American countries, you quickly realize a lot of people don't have a lot of money, right? So So he's really talking to us, and he says in chapter 5, verse 1, just to come back to where we're going to get down through verse 12 tonight. He says, "Come now, you rich." Now, if I think I'm rich, I'm going to be happy, right? He says, he flips our expectation. He says, "Weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you." Okay, and so the idea is that you should be thinking about what's happening in the future, not just now. And you remember we studied last time chapter 5, verse 2 down through 3, the things that we gain and possess in this life. How does James characterize that? Are those things lasting, or are they very impermanent and passing away? Just temporary. Just temporary. You know, the greatest evidence of that is our cars. You know, oh my word. Let's just talk about cars for a second. You know, what is the nature of cars? They break. They what? Huh? They rust, right? And the moment you think you've got it fixed, what happens? Something else happens, you know? And, you know, no matter how wealthy you are, your car still breaks, you know? I've told you, I know a billionaire. I know someone who's worth $9 billion. That's with a B. He's a Christian. And he was driving recently to a dinner that I was going to, and on the way, his car, which was a nice black Cadillac car, it broke down right there on the side of the highway. And I got to thinking about that, you know. Guy's transmission goes out, and it happens to a billionaire just like it happens to the rest of us, you know. You know, cars are not a respecter of persons in that, in that way. And the point is that no matter what your wealth, it rusts. It passes away, just like you do, right? And he just reminds us of that. Now, the problem is that we don't like to think in those terms, right? We tend to be foolish, not wise. What do we know things pass away. We know that the silver is going to corrode, all this. How do we tend to think about those things? I mean, we know everything's going to break, everything's going to pass away. How do we get through life with stuff? Yeah, Christian?
Well, we think it's not passing away today.
Right, right. Yeah, we tend to have a very short-term view of our things, right? So if I'm going to get it fixed, and it'll be fixed. We don't want to think about the fact it's going to break again, right? We don't want to think about that. Yeah, Roy?
Well, the way I see that.
Yeah.
Everything that man makes is going to break sooner or later.
Yeah.
Now, going back, I say back into the 80s, there's a battery called Interstate.
Yes.
Now, this battery will last, sometimes outlast the car.
Yeah.
8, 9, 10, 12 years of battery lasts. But over the time, over the years, they cut back on that late because they weren't making enough money. So now, if you get 3 years or 5 years out of a battery, that's good.
Yes.
But everything man makes is gonna fail. It's
Right.
gonna break.
Right.
I mean, it's just like we're going through a motion of everything is just not permanent, but it's only temporary. And our life on this earth, everything we use here is temporary
Yeah.
for us. If
Yeah.
you think about it that way. And all these things that man builds and put up for themselves treasures here on this earth, it's only temporary. They're gonna only use it for a temporary time, then what happens? They die.
Yeah.
Somebody else uses it.
Yeah.
It's a cycle like that.
Yeah.
And if you understand like that, then you can understand where your hope should be. Your hope should not be in these things that we see on this earth, temporary. It's only temporary time for us here on this earth. And our hope should be the hope of heaven, something that's eternal.
Amen.
But all these things that man built, man do great things. They build great buildings, they build great planes, yachts, boats, ships. I mean, great things. God gave a man ability to do all that. But the final outcome is for a Christian, don't get yourself so suited here on this earth, because all these things that we do and enjoy here on earth is temporary.
Yes. Good. That's wisdom. And so it is all temporary. One thing you said there, talking about the interstate battery and all that, is when it comes to our stuff, we go through the motions as if it wasn't going to pass away. right? We know, and so we're acting as if that's not the case. And at a certain level, we've got to be that way because we got to live. You got to get things fixed. So I understand that, but we tend to ignore the impermanence, the short-term nature of things, don't we? You know, and that's how one reason we get. And James is saying, hey, wisdom, as those who have money, is to recognize, number one, there's going to be an account for how you use those things, you know, and number two, you have to realize they are going to pass away. He's going to talk to us about how that should change things. John, you had a point, I think?
Yeah, I was going to say, well, fundamentally, you know, James is the person that says our life is but a mist. So fundamentally, our life is short.
Yes.
As he is. So then, you know,
right.
Just the next level of that is, of course, the things are going to be
that's good.
short because our lives are already short.
He has said back in chapter 4, verse 14, our life is just like a mist, a vapor that appears for a moment, it passes away. And like you say, he's making the point, it's true of our stuff as well. Yeah, right. So how do we get through? We tend to ignore that. He's saying, hey, you need to realize the short-term nature of what you have. And so the other way we get through life with the things that are rusting, the cars that are breaking, you know, the batteries that are going out, is we tend to focus even more on ourselves. Now, you would think, recognizing how impermanent things are, how they pass away, we would just say, well, I'm going to focus on bigger, better things. Right? It's not what we tend to do. We tend, because we have to work so hard to keep the stuff that we have that keeps breaking. I mean, I got bills to pay. How about you? Electricity bill. I don't know if you just went, did your electricity bill go up this year? My goodness, mine went up. And so, you know, you've got to focus in. You got to put your nose to the proverbial grindstone just to get by. And so we tend to focus in on ourselves more and more. So the irony is the difficulty of life makes us even more interior focused on ourselves. Now what and so one thing that you said about the interstate battery is they decrease the quality of that because they realize they're not making enough money, okay? And so they're focused on themselves, and we tend to do that, don't we? We tend to, whether it's our health or our cars or our jobs, we zero in, right? And we don't pay attention to most people. What he's going to say is like when you get that way, not only do you focus in on yourselves, you tend to not pay attention to other people, and you tend to not treat them well. Okay, he's talking about money and what it does to us, right? And so we tend, when it comes to money, to not treat other people well. You say, it's not me. But think about that for a moment. If someone is, handing out, we go out here and someone starts handing out dollar bills, right? Or let's raise the ante, Alan. They're handing out $100 bills. Okay, we walk out here in the parking lot and they say, okay, I got a $100 bill for everybody. And they go around and we're like, man, I'm glad I came to church tonight. You know, this is great. Handing out $100 bills, right? And let's just say that they get around and they get around to everybody, but when they get over to Latasha, they say, oh, I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't have another one, right? She's like, what? Wait a second, I got mouths to feed. Why do you give all these people $100 bills? And don't give me one, you know? And we all of a sudden start to see a side of Latasha we didn't know exists. And she says, well, if I can't have it, they can't have it. Or you start saying, hey, well, give me your $100 bill. See, money makes us what? Angry, right? It corrupts us. The love of money is the root of what? And so we start to mistreat people, right? And you may not have ever been a boss. I suspect most of you have had people who work for you in some way. Sometimes what you'll do is, in order to make more money, what do you want those people to do? Well, maybe cheat, maybe work too hard, right? You say, you need to come in overtime and get some. You start mistreating people in order to get more things for yourself. You say, well, not me. I'm going to tell you, yes, you. It's human nature, right, to do those sorts of things. So for example, on taxes, anybody ever cheat on their taxes? Just for the record. No, okay. Yeah. Huh? Ever lie? Yeah, right. And the idea is I'm not going to pay my fair share, right? So in other words, everybody else has to go into greater debt. Everybody else has to pay more so that I pay less, right? That's just one, innocent way of basically cheating other people, right? And so what James talks about here in these next few verses are what the rich, people who are trying to hold on to what they have and want more money, how they treat others. And then what does he say they do? He says in verse 3, he says, "You've laid up treasure in the last day. The judgment's coming. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud." Fraud is when you don't give what you should have given them, right? They're crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters has reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your heart in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. You've done wrong to people over money, and he doesn't resist you. A great example of this is your work. Let's say you're an employee, right? And you're supposed to take a vacation day, right? And rather than record that vacation day, you don't record it because you're like, oh, they have plenty. I'm just not going to record it. I'm going to keep my vacation day even though I took it, right? Or you punch out early, or you leave early and don't punch out. What are you doing? You're trying to defraud other people so you can get more. And James is saying, he says, God sees how you're living selfishly and holding on to things that are impermanent. John, you had a point a few minutes ago.
Yeah, no, it just reminds me of the conversation I was having with this morning about and I think you mentioned it, maybe something about the sheep and the goats. Like, this just screams a goat.
Yeah, a goat. Those who are unrighteous. Yeah.
Yeah, the ones who are just saving only up for themselves, only caring about themselves, not thinking about the interests of others.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's all about just building up the barn, the rich man in the barn, just building up his barn. And anybody else that's sick or troubled, it doesn't matter. Not doing anything to help them, especially monetarily.
Yes.
Because I need to, like you said, I can pay my bills and all these things. I got to do it for me.
Focused on
and
ourselves.
If somebody else is hurting that I can share with, I'm just going to,
Yeah.
it's not my problem.
Yeah. And what God is saying is, look, God sees that. God sees that.
And he calls you a goat.
And yes, and in the end, we'll hold you accountable. I'll give you an example of this. I had a good Christian in Indiana. I go over to India, and he knows about the Indian work over there. And he says, hey, I would like to give some money to help the preachers over there, help them get out to their classes. And so he sends to me a $1,000 check, And I've got this $1,000 check in my hand, And I'm human, and I think, man, I got a lot of needs. I got kids to feed. My car broke down the other day, and I'm kind of strapped a little bit financially. I wonder, I'm going to be doing some things. Maybe the person I need to fund with this $1,000 is me, right? Now, you may never have those kind of thoughts, right? But I had that thought. I said, maybe the best application of this is me. Okay. Now, would that be the right thing to do? Christian's quick to say no. Well, Christian thinks a lot. Okay. But you're exactly right. But the point, what James is highlighting, and I would, of course, would not do, well, not of course. There would be some who would do that. And if I was to be selfish and sinful, I would take that money for myself and justify it, right? I'm not going to do that. But I'm confessing to you that temptation was there, right? Can you all relate to that desire to help yourself first and not others? I could justify that 6 ways to Sunday, but that's still wrong. Yeah.
It's even harder when you're in a tough spot, especially if you have financial issues and have opportunities like there.
Yeah.
This could solve my problems.
It solves my problems. That's right. And James is fundamentally saying here that wisdom, number one, knows what money does to you, right? And he's saying, do not believe the lie that it's worth it. And that you should think of possessions ahead of people. That's the key thing here. All of those people you're mistreating and that you're even killing, that's the priority, souls. Souls, not savings, right? And I hear myself saying that. The question is, do I really believe that? Right? Do I really believe that? Because within you, there's this desire for more, because you're trying to help yourself out. Yeah.
If we were honest, all of us, I believe, we have a little bit of Judas in us.
Betrayal.
But the problem was, I think it was a place where some of them had indignation because of the costly ointment that was used.
Yes.
Now, the problem was that he was the closest to the money,
He was a money keeper.
and that seems to be where we can all fall into that.
Oh boy.
It's like you
Yeah,
talked
Judas is the
about.
greatest example of this.
What an example.
Yeah. He kept the money, he began to pilfer, to take, like I was thinking about doing that, he began to take away from the Lord's work for himself.
Nobody missed this.
That's right. And in the end, his undoing was just an overt betrayal of Jesus for money. Right? You see how that progresses. It begins with a little bit and then becomes a lot to where you can justify anything. Right? John, you had a point?
And Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5.
Ananias and Sapphira, great example. Yeah, to where they had said, I'm going to give it to the Lord, but they kept it back for themselves, didn't they? And they lied to the Holy Spirit, and they were struck dead. Yeah. Acts chapter 3. So at 4. Yeah, that's exactly right. Good example. So James is talking about wisdom. Again, we know everything I just said about selfishness and cruelty and avarice and greed. We know that's wrong. We know that's wrong. But the difference between knowledge and wisdom, as we said, is what? The ability to apply that knowledge, to do that knowledge. And he's saying, look, you have gone from wanting money to murdering people over it. And he's cautioning us against that. And that's a good lesson for us all, because none of us are immune to that love of money, right? Okay, so there's kind of a gear shift here. Some of you all know what it is to shift gears on a manual, right? So you're going along in first, second, and you clutch, and then third, and you got a little jolt, and you're into something different, right? There's a little bit of a jolt here, but it's still driving in the same direction in verse 7. Okay, so let's read verse 7 down through 9. I should say verse 8, 7 and 8. And let me ask, my question to you is, how does 7 and 8, talking about the farmer, how does that follow? From what we just read, what's the connection between the next couple of verses and what's gone before? So verse 7, my version says, be patient. Is that what your version says? Be patient, patient, patient. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. Now he talks about farmers. See how the farmer, you got a picture of a farmer? What does your farmer grow? What's your farmer grow? What's he growing? Corn. Corn farmer up in Iowa. Okay, big old farm, got the combines, or maybe it's a corn farmer in West Virginia. He's got a small little plot. He goes out there with his hoe, he weeds. That's whatever your farmer. Think about that farmer. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Okay, let's not skip over the fact that his commands are, number one, be patient. And number two, establish your hearts. Okay? The idea there is you whatever your affections, the things you desire, it's like a tent peg. You drive that down deep into something. You hold on to that. You don't just let it go after anything. You know what you're going to desire, what you're going to have affections for. Establish your heart, be patient. Okay. So his example, before we get to the connection, is the farmer. Okay. Farmer has a crop, right? Corn. Okay. He goes out, plants that corn, right? Does it pop up right away? No. Okay. It has, first of all, he talks about the early and later rains. In Israel, the early rains came in October, the late rains came in April. Early rains come, what do they do to the soil? They get it moist, they get it wet, so you can till it up. It's hard as a rock, up in the summer. So the rains come, gets the soil wet, I can till the ground, plant, okay? Grows, 5, 6 months later, the corn is just about to stalk, and then the thing that really pushes it over the edge, makes it bring fruit in a big way, are the latter rains. A lot of rain in April, it brings it all to fruition, right? I got a lot of corn, okay? So I planted my seed. How long does it take to grow? Half a year, so I got to be patient. Got to be patient, right? I know how the seasons are. I know, and so I can't rush it. Kobe, I don't know how it is in Africa, but here in the U.S., if we go to a little corn stalk and shout at it, corn grow, it doesn't work. Does that work in Africa? No, you can't force it, right? You got to wait. So what does farming have to do with being rich and having the right attitude towards money and life and being wise? Help me. That gear shift kind of jolted me here. Yeah, go ahead. Whatever you want to say.
Well, what I was going to say, it just takes time for stuff to develop.
Right.
And, but since, I was going to say, maybe back in the mid-80s and 90s, now they kind of got a little bit of cutting edge, because now they're using antibiotics
Yeah.
to make stuff reproduce almost half the time.
Right.
And which it ain't good for us to consume that stuff when we
Yeah.
use all that stuff.
That's right.
And but man went above and beyond to try to increase.
Yeah.
And I know my surgeon who did the operation on me, he said a lot of these foods and drinks that we drink, he said it's full of chemicals and full of biotics. And he said if you can't read the label on the back of it, you can't pronounce the word right. He said you don't stay away from it. But he was saying this to say that, but he was saying this. He said they have to do that because America have a lot of people to feed. If they do it really the organic way, and like they have the chickens usually take what, 8 months, 9 months to really mature. Now they got chickens matured in 3 months, but you go over that antibiotics is something that we put in there, hormones, make it grow quicker and everything.
Yeah, yeah. So Roy's highlighting how man wants to speed up the timeline, steroids and all sorts of chemicals. We don't want to wait the full time. We want to make them bigger. But I tell you what, Roy, those Tyson chickens, those chicken breasts, man, they're big and juicy and good. I don't really care what's in them. It tastes good. Anyway, but you're right, and that's the point we want to make, is that growth cycle in crops and in food and in meat and that sort of thing. You're supposed to wait to get the right thing, organic, right? Because you can distort it. You can make it into a Frankenstein chicken, or a Frankenstein a corn stalk, and we have a lot of that. And you're right, that can be very unhealthy. But this is James's point. What he's saying is you need to understand what are we trying to grow in this life? What are we trying to grow? What is the purpose of your work, of your life? Okay? And just remember, when he was talking about the rich man, notice what he said. He says, miseries are coming upon you. in verse 1. He says, all of this stuff that's corroding will eat your flesh like fire. And 3, you have lived on the earth, in verse 5, in luxury and in self-indulgence in a day of slaughter. So all these wealthy people, what is going to be that are corrupt, what is going to be the end of their work? What are they actually working for? Not money, not power, but they're going to be punished, right? And so because they're trying to take control and force what they want, the result, the crop that they're going to get is going to be the most distorted chicken, the most, bizarre cornhead you've ever seen. It's going to be their punishment, right? So rather than trying to force it and do what we want to do, what does he say? He says, you, rather than trying to be powerful and have lots of possessions, you what? Be patient. Not only be patient, you establish your heart for what's most important, right? Because what's going to happen in the end, after the early and latter rain, what's going to come? Well, the Lord's going to come. The Lord's going to come. And what we're working for, what we're living for, is so that when he comes, as John referenced, he's going to say, well done. Now, we'll be full of sin. We will have all sinned. We've made mistakes. But we will have lived for him. Right? Yeah, John?
It reminds me also of what Peter says, right? Build up treasures in heaven where moths were.
We will have our, or moth, and we won't, the idea is we'll have treasure that's incorruptible in heaven, yeah. So the opposite of being greedy is being patient. That seems strange. Why is that the case? Greed says, I want it now on my terms. Patience says, I'm willing to sacrifice now, work hard on God's terms because I'm looking for the coming of the Lord, not the coming of the loan or the money in this life. And that reorients us to what the purpose of our life is. Anything wrong with having money in this life? No. Is there anything wrong with thinking that's what life is about? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what he's doing. He's reorienting us. Other lessons from the farmer. John, whatever you want to observe.
And I think some insight I get with patience is it helps having contentment in what you have can help with the building of patience. Because being impatient means you're not content with what you have. You need to rush out and get something else to satisfy that. But if you're content with what you have, you're able to be more patient. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely it does. If you're content with what you have, you're able to be more patient, yeah. There is a lot of Ecclesiastes in James, right? Exactly. Enjoy what we have, but don't think that this world isn't vain, that this world is about the possessions. The end of the matter is to fear God and keep his commandments, as we know from Ecclesiastes. Okay, notice what he says. There's 3 more lessons we need to learn before we conclude. First of all, he says, with regard to being patient and waiting on the Lord, he says, verse 9, don't grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. The thing is I might be a very poor man and not be abusing people monetarily. But in the way that I talk to my brothers and sisters, the way I talk to my wife, my kids, I'm a grumbler. My language betrays an impatience and anger, a wanting it to have it my way. Okay? So grumbling is as bad as greed when it comes to being impatient, right? Because if I grumble against you, in other words, we have a disagreement. Christian and I have a disagreement. We're not going to be able to agree on it. And I'm going to be the judge. I'm not going to let it go, right? Who am I not trusting to be the judge and not being patient for? God. The Lord will be the judge, right? And grumbling is a sign of someone who's not waiting on the Lord. Do you have anybody I have people who grumble against me. They will not let it go. Okay? And so it's just, they cannot say, I say all the time in my heart, when I see someone who I disagree with, I say, the Lord judge between you and me. I'm going to let it go. And in the end, God's will be done. I pray for that person, right? So grumbling is a matter of impatience. Do you ever grumble against somebody? Because you can't let it go. You got that thing that's festering, that burr under your saddle, that rock in your shoe, right? You're just not going to let it go. He says, don't be like that, because the judge is coming, and he's going to judge you for your grumbling. And then he gives two final examples in verse 10 and 11. He gives two examples, and we learn wisdom not in a vacuum. In other words, not just by ourselves. We learn wisdom by seeing wisdom lived in others. Do you have a hero, someone whom in your life you look to? Maybe it's a worldly person, maybe it's a Christian, but someone who in the way they're living their life, they're not perfect, but I like how they do that. And so you model that, right? You do that. I have teachers back in my background whom I hear myself teach, and I'm like, oh, that sounds like Dr. Johnson. Because I've seen excellent teachers, and I'll say, oh, I'm going to do that. So you see wisdom and virtue is learned. And so you need to find people. It could be a friend. It could be someone online. And so the examples he gives are the prophets and Job. Look at this in verse 10. He says, as an example of suffering and patience, again, patience like the farmer, not trying to get the power, the money, the having our way. Take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Okay, behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. Okay, think about Jeremiah. Think about Isaiah. They go out. They care for people. They love their nation. They love the people of God. And what do? They speak truth to them. You shouldn't worship like that. You shouldn't have that woman. You should stop abusing people. And what happens to the prophets? They get stoned. They get put in prison. They get persecuted, right? And so, if it was me, I might just say, well, that's how you're going to be. Or I'd grumble against him. I'd just say, I'm going to fight with you. But is that what the prophets did? No, they were righteous sufferers. They continued to do what God wanted to do, even though it hurt. Especially because it hurt, right? And so patience, does patience mean that we don't suffer? No. Think about that farmer. Man, he continues to work, waiting for that crop, yeah.
Patience is long-suffering.
A synonym for patience and steadfastness is long suffering, And so how long do you have to suffer, right, is the question, right? So I'm going to suffer long. So the prophets are examples for us, the people who are living for God and will continue to do the right thing, expecting reward in the end, even though it comes at great cost in this life. Okay, so I say those things, but I just don't know that I believe it, right? Because what that means is that I'm going to defer my gratification. I'm not going to live in the moment for things. I'm going to live by faith for something I haven't seen yet, right? And that's what the Christian's called to. Why do we do that? Why do we do that? Because the greatest honor we can give to God is to say, I believe you even though I haven't seen it yet. You can't honor anybody more than that. Latasha comes to me, she says, I need $1,000 for my car. I'll pay you back, in a year, right? Christian comes to me. He says, I need $1,000 for my car. I'll pay you back in a year, okay? If I say, Latasha, yes, I'll do that. Christian, no. What does that tell you about my relationship between Latasha and Christian? It tells you a lot, doesn't it? I honor one, I trust one, the other I don't. Not true, but you see the example, right? With God, we say, I trust you, that if I live for you, I delay my gratification, I don't get greedy, that you in the end will judge me righteously. That's what faith is about, isn't it? Trusting him. I pray that you and I can have that kind of faith. And he gives the final example, which is similar. Job. Remember Job, the book of Job? We'll take 30 seconds on this. Job, he says, you have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Job had friends, right? Job lost everything he had. His friends berated him, saying, you should sin, you should die. His wife told him, you should kill yourself, basically. And Job maintained his righteousness, he even though he was suffering. And in the end, he hadn't done anything wrong, right? But he suffered, he lost everything. Did he deserve to lose everything? No, remember, Satan was the one who tempted him by losing everything. And so the steadfastness of Job teaches us what? That we should not expect justice in this world. Shouldn't, you know. You go out here and you say, I'm going to live like James was telling me, I'm going to start acting wisely. Guess what? You're likely to lose some things. You're likely to get abused and mistreated and taken advantage of. But Job was one who was long-suffering with steadfastness, and he lived for the purpose of God. And here's the key thing. At the end of Job's life, or at the end of the Job's story, what do we learn about God? Did he make things right?
Yeah.
He made things right.
Yeah, he's just, and what he's promised, he's going to fulfill.
That's right. He is compassionate and merciful. Job went through bad stuff, but in the end, God revealed his will. He made it right, and Job had more, you know, after he went through those trials than before. And so what James is saying, it's going to be the same way for you if you live patiently for God as it was for Job. In the end, you look back on it, you say, God had a plan, God had a purpose. I don't understand it all, but he is passionate, compassionate, he's merciful. Take that encouragement. That's the God that we're dealing with. Trust in him. And so James is saying, hey, use your money in the same way, and be someone whom is working hard for a result which will be fully seen when the Lord comes again. Trust in that. And so that's where he's at. We'll pick up on the importance of praying and saying certain things to each other faithfully as Christians as we finish up the book. Okay? I pray for you wisdom and insight. Lim, as one of my models of wisdom, would you be willing to pray for us that we have what James is talking about here, and that we have a safe ride on these slippery roads tonight? Please, go.
Let's pray. Father in heaven, we come to you thanking you for this day, for the rain that you have given us, for the sunshine, for all the blessings of this life and the beauty in it. We thank you for the abundance of wealth that we enjoy in this country. We pray that you'll bless us in all things according to your will. Bless us as we leave this place to our separate homes. Forgive us of our many failures and the times that we say and do the wrong things, and even our thoughts that are wrong. Forgive us and save us in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. We pray. Amen.
We're looking at Nehemiah's prayers. We're going to read Nehemiah 1 for Sunday morning, 9:30. As a reminder to the men, if you'd like to teach next quarter, there's a sign-up sheet out there. I'm taking it down tonight, and I'm going to start assigning people. So take a look at it. And we're going to have a potluck for those interested individuals who are interested. Not this Sunday, which I was reminded is Father's Day, right? But next, the following Sunday, the 22nd. So we'll have a potluck at the YMCA for those interested in that. And this Saturday, we have an evangelism effort at 10 o'clock. If you'd like to help, go out in the neighborhood, invite people, get in cars, go around, drive, invite people. And we had someone who became